What's going on, everybody? So, recently there has been a ton of talk about the future of Resident Evil games and exactly where they should head. Should they be first person mode, third person mode, fourth person mode, VR exclusive? I'm pretty sure VR exclusive isn't one of those assumptions, but a lot of people are talking about exactly where the franchise should go. And as for myself, I've been playing Resident Evil since I was just a single digit. I absolutely love the series, and I am an absolute mega fan. I've collected every single toy, album, comic. Yeah, there were comics of Resident Evil and novels that originated from the game's source material. So I figure, why not I just talk about this and express my personal opinions as to where I believe and think the Resident Evil franchise rightfully belongs. Now, first off, I had my second guesses with Resident Evil 4 Remake. I didn't particularly like the idea that a relatively perfect game was getting a remake, all for the sake of more money in Capcom's pocket. But after seeing the remake, I do believe that there were things that were added that were supposed to be added, so we can know what's coming in the future of the franchise and how the franchise is going to evolve eventually. Now, of course, Capcom has released a ton of different surveys asking us where we think this particular franchise should head and if there should even be a different remake or not. Now, I believe there should be at least one more remake. I've already talked about my opinions about Code Veronica. I feel like that game does not get the justice it deserves. I feel like a ton of people hate it, and that's the perfect Resident Evil to remake because you can just fix all the problems. But of course, Capcom is going to probably make that remake in the future, but they're also most likely already working on a Resident Evil 9. And yes, we are up to number 9. Resident Evil Village was Resident Evil 8. I think that's really clever the way they're numbering the new entries. I feel like it's a little more realistic and you sort of have to look for it, just like how you have to look for certain items in the Resident Evil games. But if I were to ask myself exactly where I would want this franchise to go, it would have to be more in the direction that Resident Evil 4 mixed with Resident Evil 2 Remake were going. I think that making zombies scary again and just making Resident Evil scary again is adding a little bit of that edge that the series needed for a long time, ever since Resident Evil 4 came out. I feel like the original Resident Evil 4 was the downfall for the series, but the remake was ironically the game that turned a lot of heads and made people rethink that if Resident Evil can be a hybrid of horror and action, and I do believe it can. I think that Capcom is eventually going to want to remake Resident Evil 6, and I think that remake is something that they desperately need as well, because a lot of the themes in Resident Evil 6 were strictly action and military based. And of course, that is ultimately where that series seemed like it was going, because they always mentioned Chris Redfield in his Air Force days. But I feel like the meat of the series was having these characters with all this potential and seeing how they MacGyver the shit out of the situation, regardless of what situation they're in or if they're alone. I feel like seeing this character do all of these things and solidifying that character into yourself and truly being this character trying to survive through this horrendous and horrifying situation that most likely no other different type of character could survive was something special that the Resident Evil series provided. It was part of its DNA and why exactly it was different from other survival horror games. It pretty much made survival horror. So the fact that the origin of survival horror was made from a military brute that is capable of anything like Chris Redfield says something about the way we look at survival. We don't see it as a thing that is provided to us if we're weak. We see it as a thing that can be provided to us at any point in time, regardless of your stature. Everybody just survives at the end of the day. And I feel like showing this person that is extremely powerful and capable still go through those same situations that a so-called weak person would go to shows that people that survive are among the strongest. And people that are put in those situations are only put in those situations because they can handle it. That it doesn't matter how strong you think the person is. It could be Vin Diesel and then they do something bad and you think to yourself, oh, they were weak the whole time. Everybody is vulnerable in their own way, regardless of how they look and what they've been through. But it's also about using that power in the most responsible and impressive way you can. And the most impressive way you can is being truer to your purpose in the situation. And I feel like a lot of these characters, regardless of how ridiculous Chris Redfield's roid rage can be, they've always stuck to their purposes and they've always done everything they could to make the situation better and to make the world better around them. Especially in the original Resident Evil game. You try to save as many lives as possible, and sometimes you just can't save them. And at the end of the game, you feel like a failure because you failed to save Rebecca, or you failed to save Barry, or even Jill. You just feel like complete garbage because you're surviving, but at the same time, you're taking care of your fellow man. And I feel like the future of Resident Evil needs to have more of that. It needs to have scenarios and situations that you squeeze yourself through and survive through, but still try to save everyone around you. Resident Evil is about doing what needs to be done and going above and beyond even that. And just getting the shit scared out of you because you're dealing with all these monsters. You're dealing with stuff that you didn't think you would be looking at in your lifetime, but here you are facing a licker, or you're facing the U3 monster in separate ways. Either way, every character is just trying to desperately survive, and that's what Resident Evil needs to stick with: desperation. It cannot overpower you like Resident Evil 6 did. I felt like I was a freaking juggernaut in that game, and most likely if I just button mash something, I can pretty much kick every zombie's ass in this city. Having these extraordinary characters do what needs to be done in a situation that seems hopeless is the ultimate form of survival. So, in my opinion, the Resident Evil franchise needs to go exactly where Resident Evil 4 Remake brought it to. It needs to stay there or get slightly more desperate or ugly. It needs to make, just like Shinji Mikami said, all of the threats something that you would have never imagined or something that you just don't want to deal with, because it's just too dang scary. And that's where the series gets everything right. It adds that horror effect to it, to all these cool characters, all these extravagant locations, and just makes everything feel like it's possible, with also at the same time making it feel like it's hopeless. I remember that was actually the theme of Resident Evil 6 before its first teaser trailer came out. All hope is gone. That's what it kept saying over and over again. And regardless where you come from, there's always some kind of argument about if hope is alive or if there are just some situations where hope just doesn't exist. And the exact antithesis of that message in the Resident Evil 6 teaser trailers were that hope was absolutely gone. But that just makes you want to do one thing. Makes you want to fight even harder. And that's exactly what Resident Evil is about. It's about finding that glimmer of hope in so much hopelessness and feeling just satisfied with everything you've done and feeling like you have so much power, but at the same time, like you have no power at all. That's the reason why the survival horror genre is the best genre I've ever played in my entire gaming career. That is a game I keep going back to and it never gets old, because replayability and survival never get old. Even if I know exactly what to do, it's those monsters and the things I fear that always bring me back to games in the Resident Evil franchise, and especially Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake. Those two games provide something very different opposed to each other. And I feel like the realism of every Resident Evil game that's coming out with the RE engine is helping the fact of fighting your greatest fear that much more realistic and believable. And you could actually go back to it because it just looks so damn realistic. And that actually helps a game like Resident Evil, because a lot of times in the older Resident Evil games, you look at the pre-rendered locations and they help the illusion for as long as they can, but sooner or later, everything becomes trivial in those classic Resident Evil games. Just like with Resident Evil 4 Original, I feel like the remake added so much more realism to it that it made it infinitely more replayable than the original game. And that's such a rare thing. So I think if Capcom wants to continue to evolve the RE engine and wants to go even more realistic with future Resident Evil games, this is the one franchise where I see that as an appropriate thing. With these other games that you fight wizards or something of the other kind, realism doesn't really have a place when you're fighting all these mystical creatures. But when you're surviving against something that could possibly be real, or it's like an urban legend like werewolves and zombies, then your imagination kind of takes over. And even with those original PlayStation 1 titles, I still thought those zombies looked as realistic as possible because we always imagine them, but we never see them in real life. And all those movies help the image as well. With Resident Evil movies nowadays, along with their shows, those shows don't help. Those movies do not help because the games are doing it as realistic as possible already. And I feel like that is the true reason why Resident Evil movies and shows just cannot work anymore, because we already have movies like that. So if you put Resident Evil on the big screen, it's just going to be a zombie movie about multiple characters that all have these incredible abilities that seem to never die. But the place that you can die is while you're playing the game. This is one game that shouldn't be adapted as anything else. It is just a survival horror game, and that is purely what it is. So with the next Resident Evil games, make it even more difficult to survive. Make the characters even cooler, but balance out the coolness factor for even scarier creatures and unprecedented situations in survival horror history. Push the envelope even further. I'm sure they can do it. I'm sure they can make the monsters even cooler and simultaneously even more scary and hopeless for the player, as well as make the player feel like they have more power. I mean, with that logic, all we're gonna get is Devil May Cry 5 with zombies. But you know what I mean. Make the characters cooler, in a realistic way. Like the customizability that you had in Resident Evil Village, I think that should be implemented into further Resident Evil games, as well as the upgradability of the guns in Resident Evil 4. I feel like that weapon system should be brought to an even crazier level by taking guns that aren't even worth a damn and mixing them with different types of things in order to make them more powerful. I feel like if you find a survival knife, mixing that with a gun and having a little stabby action at the same time having your favorite handgun would be kind of cool if you mix certain aspect of that game, because there are a lot of survival games like The Forest and Subnautica that require you to mix items and survive in a way that you know how, with some scary things here and there that push you to your limits. I feel like Resident Evil should go in that route, and I hear that Capcom is planning an open world Resident Evil game. I feel like that is the correct direction. I absolutely love the Evil Within 2, and I feel like that's the natural state that Resident Evil should eventually be at. Resident Evil is the game that eventually made future open world survival games that we have now. And they're among the most popular games that you can play right now. They all came from that original concept of survival horror and hopelessness. So if Resident Evil goes in the direction that it made and capitalizes and progresses it to a point that it still feels like Resident Evil, I feel like that would just be natural. Creating an open world Resident Evil game that feels like Resident Evil 4 would be so awesome. But it has to bring that fear factor to another level, as well as that cool factor that Leon S. Kennedy provided in Resident Evil 4 Original. And it of course needs to keep the cheese. I feel like the cheesiness of Resident Evil games makes it feel like a movie that came out in the 90s. Keeping that cheesiness style to every Resident Evil is incredibly important. So whatever Capcom makes, as long as they make something that's a little scarier, with your character progressively getting cooler and more experienced, like Leon S. Kennedy in Resident Evil 6, but balancing that out with an insurmountable amount of threats and just hopelessness would make the game feel a lot more tense like Resident Evil 4 Remake does. But it has to match Resident Evil 2 Remake's atmosphere, as well as having the same type of action that Resident Evil 4 Remake provides. Maybe it doesn't even need to provide the same exact action of Resident Evil 4 Remake. It could be exactly the same as Resident Evil 2 Remake, and I would be perfectly happy with that, as long as it has the appropriate amount of secrets, action sequences, bosses, and obviously surrounded in a horrifying atmosphere. That's really all I love about Resident Evil games. But I hope Capcom makes Resident Evil 9 everything it should be, and appropriately what the series has been driving itself to. It might not be the last one. I'm assuming Resident Evil 10 will be the last, but I'm also sure that Capcom is terrified to end the series because it has been making the most money for them. So whichever way they want to progress the series and simultaneously milk it, I'm all for it, as long as they keep the same steady pace that they've been going with the series remakes. Just bring that same energy that the remakes had, especially Resident Evil 4 Remake, into the next installment in the series. And that's all I ask. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are about this, and let me know in the comments. And I hope you guys have a good one. Later.